You've heard of my armored core. Now get ready for protected center. Anyway, bad jokes aside, this video is of my journey of how I created this abomination, and more importantly, what lessons did I learn so that I can share them to you so that you can make your own. This is not exactly a follow along tutorial type of thing, but rather a lot of details that will help you on your own journey. This is not a step-by-step guide, but if you want, you can treat it as one. So, for context, I have built other similar creations in the past, with similar goals and concepts behind them. I have the old armored core that I made, and the older armored core that I made. The old armored core is small, fast, fun, light, and most importantly, it's generally easy to modify, and it's easy to fight with and against. It's just a small little dueling armored core. So I wanted to keep as many of those good features. And then I have my even older armored core, which is closer in design to this one, which is larger, clunky, but it's big enough to have shields, and it's also big enough to actually fight other big targets, which means it can actually fight things like helicopters and tanks without getting crippled in a single shot. So from building both of these, I have learned that there's exactly one thing that is most important for building any mech that plans to be like an quote-unquote anime style mech. You know, Armored Core, Gundam, Muv-Luv, whatever you want. Its most important feature will always be its power. Specifically, in this case, its acceleration, not its top speed. So for my old armored cores, they actually had a relatively low amount of thrust. They could not actually maneuver very effectively. What this resulted in is that although they could get up to pretty high top speeds, the problem was that it didn't feel like you were in an armored core. It didn't feel like you were zooming around in a mech. Because what defines that feeling is how many G-forces you pull, how fast you can stop and start, and how fast you turn. And for all of that, thrust to weight is the thing that you need to maximize. Not top speed, not aerodynamics, just raw thrust to weight. For example, in Armored Core, the characters often pull hundreds of Gs. This thing can pull tens of Gs, but that's still better than like the pitiful amount of G-forces that my other mechs could pull because they lack in thrust. So the most important thing was to try to translate that feeling into this mech, which is why the centerpiece of this whole design is 2 entire rocket engines, which later get upgraded up to 4 rocket engines. Naturally, since we have so much power in these rocket engines, it's very important to be able to actually use them to do stuff like go up, go down, strafe, and go forwards. This control scheme that I have set up is pretty reliable at the cost of being inefficient. Generally, when you're building your own systems, you're going to want to have as much thrust as possible. The propulsion section will easily be the largest single section of your mech. What this results in is you have to sling around a lot of mass to reorient it. And the way that you do that is very important because, for example, my system uses very little logic. I think it only uses a single logic gate, and in exchange, it is a very simple, robust system. There's very little parts to EMP, almost nothing ever glitches out, but as a downside, it is less efficient. When I go forwards, the thrusters don't point straight forwards. When I go up and diagonally to the side, the thrusters don't aim directly diagonally. One of them goes to the right, one of them goes up. Because of this, there are some edge cases where it just flat out does not work, and as a whole, it is less efficient. However, this is outweighed for me personally because this mech was designed for combat, and in combat, you want to minimize complexity, minimize potential places where there could be issues, and make it as simple and reliable as possible. And it may not be efficient, but this case is very reliable for me. This setup will be uploaded to the workshop in case you want to base your own design off it, but if you want to just take a look at all the servos as I'm saying this, it's not that complicated and you should be able to replicate it decently effectively. And obviously there are gyros for the whole turning thing. Another pretty important lesson I learned, other than, very high g-forces and an effective control system, is the legs. So most mechs have legs that can, walk. The problem with, as I call them, anime-style mechs, which includes stuff like Gundam and Armored Core, it moves less like a mech where it walks and moves more like a very angry human-shaped helicopter, where it can go up, down, left, right, and it doesn't even touch the ground half the time. But even then, having effective leg systems is still important as a part of the design. So, for example, my legs do something that uses extra complexity, but it does really sell the feeling of it being that type of mech. An issue I had with my old Armored Core was that the legs can spin around 360 degrees. This was to match the direction the legs were pointing with the direction of motion. Now these legs that I have on this current design can do the same thing, but they also have a second detection system to reorient it if it flips around too far. What this means is that instead of being like a real quote-unquote robot, where most of the time most of the joints can spin 360 degrees and more, it's limited to normal, more human-looking movement of 180 degrees on the hip, which is coincidentally what most quote-unquote anime-style mechs use. Armored Core doesn't bend the hips more than 90 degrees to either side, 180 degrees total. Same thing applies to Gundam and many other genres. So if you want to have a better look that matches what you're going for, when it's actually shifting around and moving, having that is just one of those small details that helps sell the look a lot. And so as a whole, that is most of the big lessons. All it really is at its core when designing an mech like this, where it's designed to move and feel like an armored core, you don't need any complex logic for leg movement because again, 90% of the time it's going to be sliding around or flying. So it very much is just a very simple design. Thrusters, half decent legs that don't even need to do all the things that legs normally need to do, and just a stupid high amount of thrust. So the first thing that I did when I was designing my personal armored core is shrink the propulsion system. Since, having 4 rocket engines in there, that takes up a lot of space. And because I didn't want this thing to go past the complexity limit, I needed to keep it as small as I humanly could, which in this case meant that I had to compress everything as much as I could. The second thing that I did was, of course, vibes. No point in having an Armored Core looking mech if it doesn't look like it's from Armored Core, thus the cool head. 3. When designing armor and shields for these types of combat mechs, and mine is distinctly made for combat, you have to consider a few things. For example, now that every single thing with power cores is explosive, and this thing has to be borderline made of gyros to stay upright, it has a pretty big weak spot in the chest, because the moment that a single gyro goes off, a chain reaction ensues, blowing up the rest of the thing, which does make it able to die in a very dramatic way. But it does mean that I have to instead rely on energy shields for protection as opposed to more conventional armor, even though I did slip in padding where I could, as can be seen on the shoulders and on the chest spike. And obviously with this added mass, I had to add added thrust, because, thrust to weight is the single thing that matters. So in this case, I just added up another pair of rocket thrusters. I would have added more if I could, but I started having weld group issues. On your own mech, you could just add secondary systems, For example, I had one propulsion unit on the shoulders. I was and on the back, my backup plan was, if this was not enough thrust, to have one system on the shoulders and one system on the hips. So that way I could, instead of having 4 thrusters, I could double that up to 8 thrusters, which should have made it easily move like stupid fast. Another thing to consider is the clearance that the rockets have, both the rockets on the back, but also, you see how the weapon systems, specifically the shoulder rockets, they have these pistons so that they pop out. The reason is that a lot of the complex shapes in mechs, especially when they're shifting around, make it very hard to have a hard mounted gun. You can often have like guns in the hands, but if you try to put like a chest laser or shoulder rockets or back mounted, I don't know, bombs or whatever, a lot of the time you'll end up hitting your own legs, your own arms, maybe they'll twist weirdly and hit themselves. So, whatever you're planning to do for weapons for your mech, you need to make sure and double check that even if they twist way more than they should, it still won't be enough to hit yourself. So these help reduce the chances of hitting yourself, but even these 2 pistons don't fully make it safe. Which is surprising because that's like a pretty good amount of clearance, but turns out that's not enough. For the legs, I doubled the amount on the double joint. It's hard to explain. In this section, I believe the technical term is a 4-bar linkage. The reason why you want to put 2 sets of things slightly offset instead of just one pair of joints, even though that would save a lot of complexity, is that this way it always moves parallel. It always moves straight up or straight down with a light curve. But instead of bending, it just slides up and down, which is very useful for this mech, because if it just bent every time there was a harsh landing, it would look like the legs snap. But instead, it just looks like the legs fold in and compress. And it just helps them fold in and compress in a reasonable looking way. Another thing to consider is, seeing as how it's a mech and it has so many joints, and so many of them will be very slightly floppy, your accuracy on your guns, especially considering the way that recoil will propagate through the arm and cause the whole arm to jiggle, it would naturally be very, very reasonable to consider things like adding stabilizers to the arms, which is exactly what I did. However, I also had the issue of the arm is so far ahead of the center of rotation for the elbow, and all the gun weight is also way at the front. It resulted in very, very jittery stabilizers because it kept bouncing around. So to counteract that, I had to slow them down by a bunch, which isn't exactly a good solution, but it's the best solution that I had available to me. Then obviously I had the stabilizers for the body, which actually have a 15-degree leniency, which means that you'll see the mech lean forwards 15 degrees when going forwards, lean backwards 15 degrees when going backwards, and so on. And that's built into the stabilizer system, because instead of using gyro stabilizers, I just use normal gyros with angle sensors. The reason I did this is because gyros actually have more power and they're smaller, so I could pack more of them into a smaller space. And the angle sensors allowed me to tune in all the details, which allowed me to, as I've just said, give it a small amount of lean whenever moving, which again just helps really fit in that feeling and make it fit with the whole high speed feeling. And lastly, just for fun, I gave it a kick. Just for no reason. But, it's an armored core. It's gotta be able to have the ability to kick. And in the final version, you'll see that I added these thrusters on the shoulder and ankles. Those were just because I was told in Armored Core that's where some more thrusters are, so I just quickly added those on. So as you can see, this is the final product, and this is me using it in a fight. Pretty cool, pretty neat, slides around, very cool. The rest of this video is just raw combat footage. Feel free to leave, there's nothing more important past this video. The original plan for this video was to also make a second mech using a very different control scheme and thruster setup, but that would have taken even more time, and frankly, I needed to post a video, which is also why you might hear background noise in this video. frankly, I just didn't have the time to properly clear everything up. So yeah, this is your guide on some lessons of how to build your own mech, some things to consider that you might not have originally considered, and other such details from my own journey. Goodbye, and good luck with your own things. This video will keep on playing the extra combat footage until it's over.